Hello and welcome to Choose a Fi. Today on the show, we have a good friend of mine. We have Chris Terrell, who is actually the first person that I ever met in the Fi community here in Richmond, Virginia. He was actually way back. I dug into my email and I have an email from him from September of 2014 when he was the head of the local Mr. Money Mustache group. And it was the first meetup I ever had with, like I said, people here in my own local area. It was a game changer. And I've kept in touch with Chris quite literally over the last nearly decade. And he's just such an interesting guy. He's one of those people who just seems like a Renaissance man who has this incredible depth of knowledge and just a whole variety of topics. And I've considered him a mentor in my world of Fi. So I'm just really excited to bring him to the podcast. And we actually had a really difficult time narrowing down what we were going to talk about today, because probably we could record 10 different episodes in a row. But we're actually going to start with Chris's background, and we're going to talk about board games. And who knows where it might meander from there. So with that, welcome to Choose Fi. Chris, welcome to Choose Fi. I'm so excited to have you here.
Brad, I am really excited to be on the podcast. Thanks so much for inviting me today.
Yeah, this should be great. So one of the things also that I left out, you have just, like I said, such an interesting background. You were the first person that I ever heard utter the word pickleball, which is wild. You were the first person I'd ever known to play, never heard of the word. And now this sport is sweeping the country. And yeah, you are one of actually the preeminent players here in Richmond, Virginia, right?
Oh, thanks. I do appreciate that. I can hold my own on the court. Let's just go there. Yes, pickleball is really just in a boom phase right now. And in the Richmond, Virginia area in particular, it's a hotspot on the East Coast. And we have a local couple, Linda and Dave Scott, to thank for that. Well over 10 years ago, they really lobbied hard to bring pickleball to the Richmond, Virginia area. So we got it first. They planted those seeds. And those original 8 courts in Chesterfield County, Virginia, have now mushroomed into well over 100 courts in the greater Richmond, Virginia area now. It's just become so big, and it continues to get larger and larger. And yeah, I was close to the ground floor. I started playing pickleball back in 2016 and was instantly hooked on it. Dropped a 25-year golf habit stone cold after discovering pickleball.
Huh. Yeah, that's wild. And so 100 courts here locally, and I suspect something similar is happening in many cities and towns all across America with these mushrooming. But even with 100, they're packed all the time. You've tried to help me get started, and I would absolutely love. We had a 3-hour lesson one time, which I'm incredibly grateful for. And it is such a cool sport. What do you think it is about pickleball that is taking over?
I think what pickleball really does, and that's going to dovetail nicely into our discussion about strategy board games, is that pickleball checks a lot of boxes. For starters, it's a very accessible game. You don't have to be terribly athletic to play and enjoy pickleball. But the more athletic you are, the more you can enjoy the game. You can find competition that pushes you to your limits. So you can take the game as little or as far as you want to and still have a great time. It's not really age dependent because it's played on a smaller court. It relies a lot more on hand-eye coordination than simple athleticism. Its closest cousin is obviously tennis, but tennis is a much more physically demanding game. It requires a higher level of hand-eye coordination, and it's a power game and it's a speed game. Tennis was built for younger people, although you do still see people that are older playing the game. But those people, especially the older people, when they discover pickleball, they quickly gravitate toward pickleball because it's just easier and it's more fun. And most importantly, it's a very, very social game. The games are quick. A game is typically to 11 points, win by 2. It takes maybe 15 minutes to play. And the expectation is when you're at a public park that you play with different people all the time. And because of that, it's incredibly social as well. And all of those things put together have really made it the sort of game that people have discovered and fallen in love with and wondered, where has this been all my life?
Yeah.
And that's certainly been my experience, and for my wife as well. She actually introduced me to the sport, and I was very hesitant about playing. I was a golf nut for 25 years. I had a full-time job at an accounting firm that was eating up at least 50 hours a week, and I did not have bandwidth for one more thing. But one night in August of 2016, I came home on a Friday and I said, "It's date night, sweetheart. What would you like to do?" And she said, "I want to play pickleball." And I was cornered. That was it. It's like, okay, well, we're going to go play pickleball. And so we went over to the local park where the 8 dedicated courts were. And we were very fortunate that a couple of guys were out there just hitting the ball around, and they were happy to show us the game. And when it was done, Robin asked, "So what did you think?" And I said, "You know damn well what I thought." I'm hooked. I am instantly hooked. It was just so much fun. And, that's coming up on, it'll be 7 years this year.
Yeah, that's crazy. And there was something in there about kind of that pay it forward aspect. And it seems like there's something about people and pickleball that they want to teach their friends and colleagues and family about it, right?
Absolutely.
Just like those people, they were happy to show you. I've seen that now. I've only played a handful of times, but I've seen that a bunch of times already. And I wonder what it is. It's some kind of weird alchemy about this. I think it's just people love it so much and they have so much fun. And like you said, it ticks all the boxes of really a fun social outing. And it's actually a pretty cool hobby as well, because it's not very expensive. Like you said, you can play it for quite literally decades and really probably not expect to get. Can you think of another sport you could play for decades that you're not going to get terribly injured? And that's not to say you can't get injured, right? But if you're running for years and decades, most likely you're going to get injured. Even if you're playing tennis, some of these things. Do you see a lot of parallels between and pickleball in some sense?
Oh, absolutely. Your original question was, why had it caught on with a greater community? So I was staying away from originally. But now that you've brought into it, oh my gosh, it is the perfect sport. Just the perfect sport for it. Like you said, it's not expensive to play. There are public courts. A decent paddle is going to cost you somewhere between $50 and $200. And you want to go ahead and buy good shoes. Don't go out there with $40 shoes. Your feet and knees deserve much better than that. But that's basically it. A paddle, some balls, some good shoes. That's all you need. And so, again, my golf hobby. Golf is the exact opposite. Golf is very time consuming. It's very expensive. It's not FI friendly at all. And, there's still a lot of people playing golf, but it's been a declining sport now for quite a while. I don't expect pickleball to tail off anytime in the near future. It's still firmly in growth phase right now.
Yeah, it certainly seems like that. And it doesn't hurt that a bunch of celebrities are buying into professional leagues or teams in some regard. So yeah, I think onward and upward from there. And since you mentioned golf, I think when we first met, if I remember correctly, you had a country club membership or some membership of a club. I don't know if it was technically a country club, but it's been interesting to see the evolution of your personal journey just in, I guess, well, not just, but in the 9 years that I've known you. I think you found somewhere in maybe 2013, 2014, when Mr. Money Mustache was featured in the Washington Post, and you left your job, I guess, in 2020. I believe you said April of 2020. So we're talking a lot of change in that first 6 or so years that I met you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a date that's always going to be in my memory is April 26, 2013. And if you Google Mr. Money Mustache, Washington Post, that's the article that's going to come up. That was the biopic of Pete from Mr. Money Mustache. And I was having a boring day at work. My career was in IT. The job I was at, the network was running well. I did a pretty good job. So, there weren't a lot of fires. So I had a decent amount of downtime in my job. And that day I was reading through the Washington Post and I saw that article and a light bulb went off. And it was one of those game-changing moments. And I'm Generation X. And you reach a certain age where you don't have that many life-changing moments because you're sort of set in your ways. But that was one of them. And that was one of the biggest ones. Everything clicked for me. And the reason why for that was my wife and I, everything was going well for us. We were living the typical upper middle class lifestyle. I worked in IT. She had a job as a letter carrier, nice union job with benefits. So we weren't making crazy money, but we were making good money. We had 2 kids. We lived a fairly modest lifestyle, but my one thing that I loved was golf, and we were members of a local country club, and I routinely budgeted $7,000 a year to play golf. And it was always my assumption that I would work until my late 60s, just like my mother had done before me, because that's what people do, right? That's normal. That's what retirement looks like. And then I read that article, and suddenly I realized that's not what retirement has to look like. And the biggest reason why it struck home wasn't for me, but was for my wife. Like I said, my wife was a letter carrier with the post office. And though everything was great in our life, something was nagging at me, and I couldn't tell you what it was in the moment, but I quickly figured it out. And what I figured out was my wife's health was slowly but surely getting worse because of the physical nature of her job. She has a trick back, and her knees were bothering her, and continuing to deliver mail for the post office day in, day out, without break, was taking a real toll on her. So after I read that, I decided, you know what, we're going to make some changes, and we're going to get Robin retired. That was the goal. And then I figured, okay, back of the napkin math, back in 2013, yeah, I'll be about 58 when I retire as well, but we're going to get my wife retired first. That's the most important thing. Well, fast forward ahead, 4 years later, Robin retired in 2017, and it's been a fantastic experience for her. Her health is better now. She's glad to be out of the post office. It's not a very fulfilling job. All of the horror stories you hear about the post office, they're mostly true. Truth be told, I worked for the post office for 5 years in my 20s.
Did you really?
And it's not the sort of thing it wouldn't be my first choice for a job. Pays well, union benefits, federal benefits, that's all wonderful. But it will slowly crush your soul over time. And she did it for 29 years. That was plenty.
Wow. Yeah, Chris, so much there. So much there. I think for all of us, when we find FI, it's how does this sink in? And I think for you, in the question, kind of one of the operating principles is, what's your why? And I think a lot of people, this might sound like deprivation at first. And I clearly don't think the journey to FI is deprivation at all, frankly. But for many people out there who are accustomed to spending all their money, it does sound like deprivation, right? You could have made an argument, oh, golf is what I do. That $7,000 is an integral part of my happiness. And it may have even been true. But once you had that why of Robin retiring and leaving her job that is severely impacting her current health, and then obviously the health is not going to get better if she was going to continue carrying letters for years and potentially more, that is a remarkable thing. And it sounds like that was the lightning bolt.
Absolutely. Yeah, Robin was the real spark. And I love how you tied in that part about golf being an integral part of my life, because it absolutely was. And when we decided to make changes, we made some pretty radical changes. And those radical changes found us an extra $1,000 a month. I mean, $12,000 a year. And we took that $12,000 a year and put it straight toward investment. And that $1,000 came from a number of different buckets. But the big three entertainment-wise were golf, eating out, and cable television, which are so typical middle class, even for people who don't play golf. You know, lots and lots of people spend a lot of money on cable TV, spend a lot of money on eating out. And you're right, that does sound like deprivation. But the funny thing about it is, I'm a guy who has a lot of hobbies. And the time that I was spending playing golf was simply taking time away from other hobbies. So I think happiness is how you fill your time. And you can find happiness in lots of different places. And I know at some point we're going to get in depth about strategy board games. And I've been a board gamer since I was a teenager. If you've ever seen Stranger Things, yeah, I was one of those kids. I was playing Dungeons and Dragons in the 1980s, and I never, ever stopped loving games. Now, the kinds of games I played changed over time. I haven't played Dungeons and Dragons since the 80s, but the whole concept of gaming is just so much fun and fascinating and extremely inexpensive. I started doing more of that when I dropped golf. I picked up a hobby called disc golf that I'm sure a number of people do, and that's become more and more prevalent in the Richmond area. There used to only be one disc golf course in the 90s when I first picked up the game. Now there's probably 10 in the area now, and lots of people play it. It's also dirt cheap to play. literally all you need are 4 or 5 discs that run about $15 each. For less than $100, you are getting a lot of exercise. You're outside. It's a fun sport, and it is a bare fraction of the cost of golf. And yet I could walk off the disc golf just as happy as if I were playing golf itself. Golf itself was expensive and fun. Disc golf was just fun.
Well, isn't that interesting, right? It gets to the essence of why are you doing something? And I think I've used this one example so many times that people are probably tired of me saying it, frankly. But I talked about my wife, Laura, and we would go out for happy hour. And craft beers, you go out, and it's interesting. I actually don't drink any alcohol anymore. Not that I was ever someone who drank a lot, but so this is kind of in the past. But we used to go out for happy hour all the time. And you'd go out for $6-7 beer each, plus tax and tip. Maybe you'd have a second one. I mean, you're talking about a fairly expensive, really, what was the essence of what we wanted? And that was to spend time together, right? And
Exactly.
we were very easily able to do that by buying a 6-pack of craft beer still for $12 at $2 a beer then, or maybe even less, frankly, at Wegmans. And we could spend the time, as long as we carved it out, we could spend the time together. And that's what we wanted from that experience. And it sounds like what you're saying here is, yes, golf was expensive. What I probably loved, if I could read between the lines, is the 4 hours with friends or with somebody from the club who maybe I'm tangentially related to. And I just had a great conversation with them. I had some fun. I was outside. I was walking around, all of these things that you can get from disc golf.
Exactly. I've always played sports. I've played sports since I was a kid. And golf was one of those things that I could continue to compete at. And I love to compete. Whether it's golf, disc golf, pickleball, strategy board games, you name it, I just find a lot of enjoyment from that. And the reason why I loved golf so much was because that was something I was exposed to by my father when I was very young. And my father passed when I was young, so that memory stuck with me. And so when I had the opportunity to play golf, I fell in love with it. But even though that was my tie into golf itself, there's nothing that special about golf compared to any other game. Any other sport where you're being athletic, you're being with others, you get to compete, you get to be social, all of those things are there. And so much of FI is optimizing. Golf is not an optimal sport. It really isn't. Pickleball and disc golf are incredibly optimal sports. You get the same experience, the same exercise for a bare fraction of the cost.
Yeah. I love how this conversation is kind of taking a little turn here in the sense that it's more about frugal FI hobbies. That's really the overarching theme here of, hey, what are these things that you can do that are fun, that are getting, like you said, you're optimizing, you're getting the essence from it, and you can play for decades. That, again, is the beautiful part about board games.
Right.
Keeps you sharp forever. You could play those, again, we're teasing this so much, we're going to talk about this in depth, but pickleball. People undoubtedly in their 70s and 80s that you've played with, and it's just fun. You can play forever. Again, you alluded to, of course, just like anything, if you have more athleticism, if you have more hand-eye coordination, there's a higher likelihood if you play often enough that you're going to get good. But there's so many people out there playing, and it sounds like you're just rotating out. It's an 11-point game. You're having fun. And that's what's cool about these frugal FI hobbies. And yeah, I know one other thing that you do, which again, is just so interesting to me. You're part of the Richmond Pinball Collective. Is that another one?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the Richmond Pinball Collective. And that is I found the Richmond Pinball Collective. I initially was interested in it when they opened up in, I believe, 2017. But I was incredibly busy with work. I loved pinball, but I didn't make any friends over there. And I just didn't have the space for it. So I joined for 6 months. I let my membership lapse. And then when I did move into semi-retirement in 2020, I thought, this is something I have time to pick back up again. Of course, the pandemic hit.
Right.
And so there was no Richmond Pinball Collective for the better part of a year while everybody was in lockdown. And it wasn't until the vaccines came out and it was, relatively safe to go back outdoors again, or go back indoors again, more accurately, that I was able to discover this. And so about a year and a half ago, I joined Richmond Pinball Collective, but this time I made friends there and I fell in love with the place. And now I serve on the board there. And it's a fascinating hobby, but It can either be frugal or not be frugal. If you own and collect pinball machines, you may as well be playing golf because you are going to invest thousands and thousands of dollars into these machines. I will say they hold their resale value. So if you buy a pinball machine for $5,000, which is a very real thing, chances are if you maintain it well, you'll sell it 3 years later for about that same $5,000. They are not depreciating assets like cars. They don't necessarily appreciate, and it can be economy dependent, but they tend to hold their value. So if you're that kind of person who has a collection of 7 or 8 pinball machines, and there's probably 10 or 12 people in the Richmond area who have that, they might have literally $50,000, $70,000 worth of pinball machines, which is a lot of money that could be working in other places. Take that 70,000. I mean, shoot, if you had $70,000 right now, you can get a 5% CD from Capital One, and that's $3,500 a year of cash that's just coming in the door.
Yeah, that's a big opportunity cost. So maybe pinball wasn't exactly.
No, here's the thing. But you can be a member of the Richmond Pinball Collective, which is in the south side of Richmond, and membership is $20 a month.
Huh.
And all of the pinball machines are on free play.
Wow.
So for $240 a year, you have full access to 31 pinball machines all year long. So I am never going to be the person that owns $50,000 worth of pinball machines. That's just not who I am. I do own one pinball machine now, and it was exactly $2,300. It was a game that I played in my childhood, and I'm very sentimentally attached to it. And I can sell it tomorrow for $2,300. So I'm not really worried about that money. But yeah, I spend a lot of time at RPC. I enjoy helping them out. I believe in their mission. We're all led by volunteers. And my actual cost there is less than $500 a year. It's a cheap hobby. And I get a ton of bang for the buck out of it.
Yeah, I love that. And also something that you didn't mention is you're finding like-minded people.
Right.
Like that is a very self-selecting group in your particular case. And now there might not be a pinball collective in every town or city that people are talking here, though I suspect they exist in a lot of places. But more importantly for the audience is, where could I have a hobby? I can find other friends that are into something similar. There's a reasonable likelihood of, especially if it's something niche, that there are going to be a lot of commonalities here between you. And you might make new friends. And that is really the spice of life, as far as I'm concerned. It's this community, it's making relationships. And I think that's what we're trying to seed here is, okay, what are these 5 frugal hobbies that we can look for? Another one that jumped out to me was outdoor exercise classes.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like you can generally, I know here in Richmond, and of course we're probably boring the audience with all our local Richmond stuff, but there are 2 that you can pay for, but there are many of these groups that get together for free. I think there's one called F3, and I know there are a handful of others. And I suspect in every city and town in America, there's Park Run, which is another one that I've mentioned in my newsletter, that's all across the world, actually. They have free 5K races every Saturday morning, I think, which is just a cool one. And again, getting outside, meeting people, meeting new people, and exercising. I mean, that is a win. You can find these through meetup.com. Just Google local outdoor exercise class. You never know what you're going to find. I know I've done that in the past. And Chris, I don't know if you have, but I absolutely love doing that outdoor exercise. So for anybody out there, highly, highly recommend it. I've seen many of these groups, and they can cater and tailor to wherever you are on your fitness journey, which is pretty cool. So, Chris, I wanted to just touch on one financial thing that you mentioned before. This is really critical. You said the big 3 in your case, right? It happened to be golf, eating out, and cable TV, where you cut out about $1,000 a month in your budget, which is remarkable.
Yeah, there were a few other things as well. We found a cheaper cell phone plan, just, all those classic Mr. Money Mustache tricks. My wife was overpaying for a life insurance policy that she did not need, and I was able to convince her to cancel that. And you're right. It sounds like, wow, you just knocked $1,000 off of your budget, most of which was entertainment. You must be living a pauper's life now. That sounds miserable. I'm going to tell you that I became even happier after we did this because, one, we had no lack of hobbies whatsoever. We still had lots of fun ways to spend our time that were now getting the bandwidth that had been shut off before. And the other thing was we were building toward a goal. Instead of just treading water, well, we weren't treading water. We were saving for retirement. We were doing the right things, but we were in a much lower gear than most of the FI community would be. Now we were building towards something, and I was excited, and I stayed excited for years. And I wouldn't have it another way. I never once felt deprived. I always see that in forums where people make it sound like the FI journey is about deprivation, and it is absolutely not.
No, it's not at all. It's about creativity, and it's about finding that why. And I think you've hit both of them beautifully. And just to remind the audience, so for every $100 a month that you cut out of your budget, that is $30,000 less you need in your FI number. $30,000. So it's real simple, right? $100 times 12 to get you to your annual expense. So that's $1,200 a year that you've cut out, multiplied by 25. Because we always say, what's your FI number? It's 25 times your annual expenses, right? So the same concept works for just talking about a little portion. So for every $100, that would be $1,200 a year times 25 is $30,000. So in Chris's case, he cut out $1,000, which means his FI number, his and Robin's FI number had to be $300,000 less, which is remarkable for, as he's saying, there's no deprivation here. He cut out golf and brought pickleball in. And now, frankly, pickleball is probably, Chris, if I could speak for you, much more a part of your life than golf was, even though as much as you love golf, I know how much you are addicted to pickleball now.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Pickleball has been so much more satisfying than golf was. And I had a lot of fun playing golf. Don't get me wrong, but pickleball has scratched many more itches than golf could because it's just more dynamic of a sport than golf is. I've thoroughly appreciated that. And if I could build on what you were saying about the economics of it, Robin and I were a little late to the game compared to most of your audience. I was 46 years old when we started our FI path. And when I put together our financial net worth for the very first time, actually putting everything on a spreadsheet, I realized that Robin and I had a net worth of approximately $250,000. So you're 46 years old. You're only worth $250,000, which I'm sorry, only isn't the right word, but we're worth $250,000, which is nowhere near FI for most people. That's a lot of work to do. And it was shocking to me how quickly that number built once we started making some changes. It really moved up quite quickly. So where I'm going with this is if people are saying, well, FI is such a tough journey and I don't have that kind of money. I don't have $1,000 a month. Well, if you start much earlier than 46, then you don't have to put away nearly that amount of money because compound interest is going to be your friend at that point. For anybody who's starting even 10 years earlier, 36, it's just a game changer. And so it's much more doable than I think people give themselves credit for.
I agree. And it is never too late, which is kind of the subtext here, right? It's never too late at all because at its essence, it's a math equation. And I know we don't like to get bogged down in the math, but it is. And that to me is a hopeful thing. This is not about being perfect when you're 22 years old. It just isn't, because this would not be something that has really swept the world to a large degree. It wouldn't be relatable because we've all made mistakes, Chris, right? I've talked about catastrophic mistakes that I've made, and yet I was still able to reach FI in my 30s. And right. I think that's a really hopeful thing in that when you are looking to optimize your life, when you have that kind of as an operating principle and you can save some money and you can always make changes, you can make your life better. And that, again, that hope aspect of it and that understanding of the autonomy, the control is in your court. It's not some other elusive they, and you can't beat yourself up about what you've done in the past because it quite literally is the past. And that, again, is another beautiful, hopeful thing that I'm going to make changes today and every tomorrow thereafter to make my life better. That is a message that resonates.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. My kids are 35 and 27 now. And, I have discovered over time that the saying that we become our parents, it's not 100% true, But I also believe in that saying that apples don't fall far from the tree. And so I know they've been watching our journey over the last 10 years, and some of that has been sinking in. And they watched their father go semi-retired at 53 years old.
Nice.
5 years earlier than I thought I would. I thought it was going to be 58 when I got out. And it was 53. And I say semi-retired, I'm working because I want to. I have a part-time job that I love that's not a lot of hours, but I could give up tomorrow if I had to. We would be just fine without it. And my kids are seeing this, and they don't have $1,000 in their budget they can cut out right now. They just don't. But they can find $100 a month, $200 a month, $300 a month. They can absolutely do that. And with time, my son is 27 years old, and I constantly remind him, Matt, you're always going to be 29 years younger than me. Whatever happens in life, you're always going to be 29 years younger than me. And here are the mistakes I made in my 20s and 30s, and I can be a mentor to you now. So even though I'm in a place that seems distant and unreachable and doesn't feel very real because we do have such an age gap, I remind him, you're actually much further ahead than I was when I was 27 years old, because when I was 27, I was carrying probably $20,000 of debt, a lot of it credit card debt.
Yeah. And those lessons to see that. And it is hard for people sometimes, right? Especially like you're saying, your son in his mid-20s. But it is astonishing how much of a difference that compounding can make, and making these changes and continuing to save money and increasing your savings rate. You and I both say you saw it literally over a 4-year period. That's what's remarkable. Yeah, it's wild. I think we have just an odd sense of the scope and scale of our lifetime. And it's hard to wrap your mind around sometimes. But it is interesting when you kind of orient yourself to, I always look at it in terms of how quickly is my money going to double? So that's kind of how I orient, almost like a decade in a sense. Right. So we've talked about the rule of 72, which sounds like very official, and it's not at all, but it's just like a back of the envelope math. You take the number 72 and divide it by, let's say we expect to get on average an 8% return in the stock market. In theory, obviously, nobody can promise any amount of money, any return. Anybody who says they can promise is a fraudster, frankly. But on average, 8% is roughly where we go. So just simply 72 divided by 8 equals 9. Okay. So 9 is the number of years it would take your money to double. So back of the envelope, just say a decade, right? So in your case, that $250,000, even if you hadn't saved any additional money, would have been $1 million in 18 years, right? And then $2 million, because again, it keeps doubling from that, which is the wildest part.
And that's the exponential part that people can't wrap their heads around until they get there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then it's real because, when $1,000 doubles to $2,000, $1,000 is nice, but it's not a lot of money. But 2 becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16, becomes 32, becomes 64, becomes 128.
Yeah.
And hopefully you're contributing more and more to that. And then when that curve does launch, when you see that taking off, that for me was the real light bulb moment. When I was looking at our personal finances, one thing that I did with Robin does not like doing the math. It's not her thing. I love doing the math. I can geek out on a spreadsheet. What I would do to keep it simple for Robin, and I would recommend to anybody listening to this podcast, is I had a simple spreadsheet where I recorded our assets in one column and what we owed in another column, even including future taxes. Like if you have a 401k, you're going to pay taxes on that eventually.
That's crucial.
Yeah, you will pay taxes on that. And at the end of each month, I would update that and just start a new tab. And then I would bring Robin into the room and go, here's where we are. This is how much progress or lack of progress we made over the past month. And what I got from that was month to month, you could have big swings. But as that data started pouring in, I started it in June of 2013. So now this year, I'll have 10 years of data that I have and I can look back on. I can see where it really took off from that $250,000 starting point back in 2013 to where we are today. And
it's remarkable.
Again, my wife was a letter carrier. She wasn't a lawyer. She was not a doctor. I was an IT manager. I was making good money in IT, but frankly, I know people make a lot better money in IT than I have. I was sort of a middle of the road guy, maybe a little higher than middle of the road, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think that, again, is one of those things about FI, like why does it resonate? It's because it is the one reliable way that middle-class people can get wealthy.
Exactly.
Because it's slowly. That's the answer.
Right.
And there's no secret to it. It's save a significant amount of your income and optimize your life over years and maybe a decade or two, or maybe more, depending on where you are. You're going to reach financial independence. And for most people, frankly, right, they're going to wake up in 20, 30 years, most people, and have nothing, no net worth or no appreciable net worth. And that, again, is what's beautiful about this is the one reliable way for middle-class people to get wealthy. And that's what I love about it.
Absolutely. It's 100% achievable for a much larger slice of the population than the average person realizes.
Yeah.
I think that if you were to ask the average person, they would say only doctors and lawyers get to retire early because you have to make that kind of money to do it. And it simply isn't true.
No, not at all. Chris, this has been amazing. So I feel like we could talk for hours just about FI stuff, but we have teased so many times the board game thing. So I think we need to get into that at this point, right? So I know you have multiple pages of notes here. And as the audience certainly knows, for all the times that I've talked about board games, our family, we are board game nuts. I think it is just an incredible, incredible hobby. It's a wonderful way to connect. I think it's a great family learning tool on the one hand, but also just a wonderful way to have family fun. That's what we call it, like family fun time. And 45 minutes, an hour, whatever it may be. Some games are shorter, some are longer. And you're sitting around a table in person. You are, like we've talked about, it's completely frugal because you buy one game for $30 to $50, most likely. You could play it dozens upon dozens of times. So it is the epitome of a frugal hobby. You're thinking, strategizing the entire time. And it's also kind of a representation of life in that things are constantly changing and you have to adapt and evolve as such. So that's kind of like how I, at a very high elevator pitch, talk about board games. But I'd love to hear your elevator pitch for board games.
Oh, sure. Thanks. So like I said, I've been playing games since I was a kid. I love the decision space that you have in games. I love the competition. I just loved everything about playing games. And I really enjoyed the better games that frankly didn't exist in large numbers back in the 1980s. I think that was what made Dungeons and Dragons so revolutionary in 1981 when I first started playing the game. Was there was absolutely nothing like it out there. And when I look back at the rule set from 1981, it's horrible. It's cumbersome. It has so many problems, but there was nothing better for my group anyway. And again, just think Stranger Things if you need some sort of analogy, but without the monsters. And that was us. So what happened with games over time? So strategy board gaming became better and better over time. And I think that the moment when they really changed was 1995. In 1995, a game was released called Settlers of Catan, and it's now known as Catan. And most people in Generation Z are already familiar with this game because it's become ubiquitous. There were 32 million copies sold by 2020, and that was, Lord only knows what that number is like after the pandemic. So there's a huge number of games out there. And for a lot of younger people, they grew up playing games like Catan, Ticket to Ride, Wingspan, things like that. Whereas my generation grew up with different games. So when I mention strategy board gaming to my peers, they say, oh, you mean like Risk and Monopoly, right? And when they say that to me, my thought is, if I were introducing somebody to pizza for the first time, I could do worse than Papa John's and Domino's, but it's probably not where I would start. If I wanted somebody to fall in love with pizza, I wouldn't start with Papa John's. There's nothing wrong with it, but frankly, there isn't a whole lot right with it either. And that's the trouble with Risk and Monopoly. Monopoly came out in the 1930s, and just like Dungeons and Dragons in the 1980s, there was nothing better at the time. But Monopoly is a terrible game on so many levels, and I'm going to get into that at some point. And Risk was an interesting war game, but it also doesn't hold up well over time. But they sold millions and millions and millions of copies. And so people are familiar with it. So a lot of people, when they think strategy board games, Risk and Monopoly, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the modern games, which are sometimes called Euro games because they came out of Europe originally, but now they're developed everywhere. And these games are just better games. And you'll find them online. You will find them in bookshops. You'll find them in specialty stores. But if you go into a generic Target, you're going to not see as much of them, or you're going to see them interspersed with Risk and Monopoly, and you're not exactly going to know where to start. And later, I want to talk about, if anybody's interested in getting in the hobby, I'm going to mention several games where these are the games that you want to start. Ooh. But anyway, where I'm going with this is strategy board games really came out in 1995 and have taken off ever since. And I absolutely fell in love with the modern strategy board gaming genre, which is now 28 years old. So a strategy board game can have 3 different types, basic types. Some strategy board games have numeric goals. The highest score wins. Several people will play, and whoever has the biggest score at the end of the game wins. And a great example of that would be Ticket to Ride. Other games are what I call race games. It's the first person to reach a certain goal. So if anybody has ever played Catan, they understand that the game ends when somebody gets to 10 points. That's what triggers the end of the game. And some games have objectives. There is a game that came out in 2008 called Pandemic, which is a cooperative game where the people playing are competing against the game, not competing against each other. And their goal is to cure 4 diseases before one of 3 bad things ends the game. And so at the end of the game, at the end of the day, every single strategy board game is a puzzle. And that's what I want to focus on. It's a puzzle. For people who like puzzles, that's all a strategy board game is at the end of the day. You are playing a puzzle with other players, and if you solve the puzzle better than your competitors, then you win. But the reason why it's fun for your competitors is, unlike Monopoly, where my goal is to take every single dime that you have and bankrupt you, I win the game if I solve the puzzle just a little bit better than you do. We might be playing a game of Wingspan, for example, where the final score is Brad has 100 points, I have 95, and Robin has 90. Robin will have had a good time playing the game, even though she finished in last place. But she had fun solving the puzzle, and she just didn't quite solve it as well as Brad did. And that's why I think people are drawn to games. People like puzzles.
Yeah, that is a cool way of describing it. I never would have conceptualized it that way, but when you talk it through, that's pretty obvious. And how we look at it also is there are people who sometimes pick up those puzzles quickly, right? So when we open a new game, and of course it depends on the game, I seem to, for some reason, pick up the game fairly quickly. So I might win the first couple of times we play through. And this is maybe mitigated a little now because my kids are dramatically better than me. So I'm probably winning less often. But I think my kind of top speed, let's say, is maybe lower than the 3 ladies in my family. So I have a way of getting through that learning curve or figuring out the puzzle quickly. But then once they catch on, it's lights out for dad, essentially.
Right. You accelerate faster, but they have a higher top speed.
Much higher top speed. So, but that again is another cool aspect of games, right? Is that replayability.
Yeah. And when we play those games, so, one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is why are strategy board games important, especially in the FI community? FI is not simple. You can't just pick up a FI book and it be 10 pages long and you do these things and you figured out FI. That's that. If that were the case, you wouldn't have the number of podcasts you have at this point. It's a complicated subject, and there are lots of pitfalls along the way that people might fall into. Some of them, life just happening, but some of them they create for themselves. And what strategy board games do is they teach you skills that are not obvious, they're subtle, but they allow you to become better at certain key skills that you will need both in your career and in your FI journey to get where you need to be. And I can tell you, having played these games, it made me a much, much better project manager over the years, having played these games, because I was able to focus on key concepts like priorities, optimization, using your time to the best advantage. And that's what these puzzles do. They train your mind that way. And I love the fact that you bring up your kids, because education is so important for today's youth, because it's not the 1960s anymore where you could leave high school and go to work for Ford Motor Company building cars. Some of those jobs still exist, but the higher paying jobs tend to be jobs where you have to be thinking on your feet. And those skills are incredibly difficult to pick up in public or private school. They're soft skills that there just isn't a textbook for that. There isn't a textbook for optimization. There isn't a textbook for priorities. These are things that are learned organically. And strategy board games is a fantastic way for your kids to learn these skills organically, and they aren't even aware they're learning, and they're having fun at the same time. It checks virtually every buy box for a parent.
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. And yeah, and I kind of alluded to this before, but sitting down at a table for 45 minutes and having to make dozens or hundreds of decisions and having to adapt to, in some cases, like you talked about, what the game is doing to you and also what the other players are doing, and having to, it's very rare that you sit down and within the first 5 minutes set a strategy and never veer off that course. That so infrequently happens. And that is like life. Things are constantly changing. You can have the best laid plans, but you have to adapt. The world is uncertain. There's an uncertain amount of resources you have to figure out. You have to sometimes trade with other people and figure out, hey, what are they going for? Of course, you're trying to get the best result for you, but sometimes it has to be a win-win.
Right.
But right, like you said, maybe I'm just getting to that ultimate result in that race a little quicker, even though I set up a win-win. That's just a cool aspect of it.
I know. And the other good thing about a strategy board game is if you lose, no big deal.
Yeah.
I say that, but when you're an 8-year-old and you lose a game for the first time, that doesn't feel a bit good, because that's your very first experience losing a game. I've lost literally thousands of games now over the course of my life, literally thousands of them. And learning how to win with grace and learning how to lose and realizing, especially with a strategy board game, that it's just no big deal. And what did I learn from the experience? Or did I just simply have fun? Those are good skills to have as well.
Yeah, they really unquestionably are. And I think, yeah, one thing that we've done in our house, obviously, you always tailor games to the age appropriateness, if you will, of where your kids are. But I think parents out there will be shocked at how well their kids can play some of these strategy board games.
Absolutely. I have played a number of games with children who are 8, 10, 12, 14 years old. And by the time they're 14 years old, they're as good as you. If they've been playing games since they were 8, they have already figured it out.
So my younger daughter, Molly, is 11 now, and she is decimating us in the newest game. So Laura got this game called Quacks of Quedlinburg.
Oh, yeah, it's a fantastic game.
It's marvelous. We've played it somewhere on the order of 20 times, and Molly has won all 20 times.
Oh my gosh.
It's astonishing. I mean, like, it's crazy. But that game is also, when you talked about lessons for Phi, talk about compounding benefits. So it just winds up, there are 9, I guess, runs through, if you will. I'm trying to think of how to describe this in the easiest way. And the compounding benefits you get from just being a little ahead in the first round and the second round and the third round. We know, we've played this game so many times and gotten destroyed by her so many times that we know it's essentially over sometimes by the end of round 2, because that compounding benefit of she's able to get a couple extra points. She's able to buy a couple extra cards, or I guess chips, that set her on her way. And it's
no way to reel in the leader at that point. She is off to the races, and there's not much you can do about that. So my follow-up question to you, Brad, would be, I'm familiar with the game Quacks, but I haven't played it personally. I understand it's a fairly typical strategy board game, and it's in the top 100 games on the Board Game Geek list of their ranking of best games. When you play this game, what is it that she is doing just a little bit better? And what is it that you are proud of as a parent? Because whatever she's doing better, that's some sort of skill that she's going to be able to carry forward into other things in life. And she's already learned it as an 11-year-old.
Yeah, what a great question. Laura and I are still exactly trying to tease this out because we're like knocking our heads against the wall of like, why is she crushing us again and again? I think it's just simply better decision making. She's able to tease out very early what the best options to purchase additional chips are. So in each game, you have different options and there are different permutations of how you can set up the game. And there's something about how she's able to just quickly glance at, let's say, the roughly 6 options of chips you're able to buy,
Right.
and immediately know, based on all the other chips that are available in this, that that's the strategy that I want to go for.
So what she does better than the two of you, not that you're doing it poorly, but she's simply doing it better, is she's figured out the valuation of the game. She can look at 6 chips and immediately see that chip number 3 is the best of the 6 chips. So she can spot the value in that. And that's we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And that's an incredibly valuable skill to have. Maybe the most important skill, I think, that somebody can take from board gaming, with maybe the exception of prioritization.
Yeah, agreed. Valuation is huge. And there's also, I think the other thing she does is there's some probabilistic nature of this where you have to, I guess, what's the phrase? Decide whether you want to stop pulling chips from your bag or keep on going and risk exploding your pot, let's say. So in this case, she takes very calculated gambles and she's ever so slightly more aggressive, but she does it in a measured manner where she's not making ridiculous choices like it's a 75% chance she's going to explode this pot and she goes. But whereas I think Laura and I are a little too defensive. And I don't know if it will eventually catch up to her because I think she's doing it intelligently enough that it seems to be working over a not altogether small sample size anymore. This is veering into large sample size.
Right. So she has an innate sense of probability, which is another fantastic skill to have.
Yeah, it's wild. And I wonder, I think there is some level of innate, but I think also, frankly, some of it is learned from playing board games since we were playing Catan and Ticket to Ride with her when she was 5 years old, before she could even read.
I would offer that she learned about probability playing Catan. She recognized that the 6 and 8 tile were far more likely to produce resources over the course of multiple games than 2 and 12. And because she picked that up when she was a 5, 6, 7-year-old, as an 11-year-old, she had already learned some of the key elements of probability without being able to say it out loud. She probably couldn't articulate what probability is, but she knows it and she knows how to use it.
Yeah, that's cool. That is absolutely cool. And I can't wait. My next foray is teaching them both poker, because I think that is the perfect kind of microcosm for life and probability and uncertainty and sample size. And you can make the right decision and it could still turn out poorly in that one instance, but over a long enough timeline, it's going to be the right decision. Or it's always the right decision, but it's going to turn out well based on the probabilities.
Exactly. Yeah, that's something I've been fighting with as an adult all my life. If I have an 85% chance that something is going to happen, like, for example, if I'm rolling a die and any number but a 6 is good on that die, which is about an 83% chance, then I don't expect to roll a 6. And I'm always disappointed when I do, but I've been seeing this result my entire life. You know, those 6s are going to come up 17% of the time, but I'm still wrapping my head around that's not supposed to happen. Well, supposed to happen in probability, that's an entirely different discussion.
Right. And in that case, if you had the likelihood, an 83% roughly chance of a positive outcome, and you were given that die again and say, hey, do you want to roll or do you not want to roll? You would roll in all likelihood, depending on the circumstances, but you would roll 100 times out of 100 because the odds are so stacked in your favor in that scenario, understanding that it's going to come up negative 16, 70% of the time. And that is life.
Yeah, 1 in 36 chance that you're going to roll a 6, pick up that die, drop it, and roll a 6 again. 3% chance.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
So, Brad, when we talk about strategy board games and some of those key concepts that people learn over time that are important to them, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what I consider to be the top 4 concepts and why they're important and how you learn them. And those 4 concepts are prioritization, valuation, probability, and optimization. And these are things that you are not going to find in a textbook at school anywhere, but yet are absolutely essential to what we do, both in our FI journey, in our career, and what we want to see our kids to learn over time. So I'm going to start with prioritization. Prioritization is basically what is the thing that I am going to focus on, and what are the things that I'm not going to focus on. One of the things that I think people trip over, even people that have already reached FI, is that they do not have infinite time. You could probably go into somebody's house and they have a dozen different hobbies that they have that they don't touch because it was a good idea at the time, but they never got around to it. And you can see that clutter in their house.
Yep. And they've done that.
Yeah, exactly. And I struggle with this all the time because even though I'm mostly out of the working world, I have a lot of hobbies and I have a lot of friends. And where do I focus that time? And strategy board games teach prioritization. There are so many games that have what's called a big decision space. And a decision space is simply the number of different decisions you can make. So I told you I was going to bust on Monopoly a little bit. Here's where I'm busting on Monopoly. There's almost no decision space. You roll the dice, you move to a property, and if you have the money, you buy it. And that's the only thing you do over the course of the game. And then you buy houses and hotels and you bankrupt your opponent. There's almost no strategy to it. But a really good strategy board game, there are lots of different things that you can do. And what is your priority toward winning the game? Because strategy board games have lots of rabbit holes you can go down as well. And you need to have some sort of focused strategy. And it's very easy to pursue paths A, B, and C when you really need to focus on just path B and focus on that strategy to win a game. Like if you're playing Catan, for example, if you are building the longest road, you can't be doing other things as well. You continue to build roads so you get that 2-point bonus. So you have to stay focused. I think prioritization teaches focus. And in a world of screens, that's a big skill to have, to be able to stay focused. I think every single one of us struggles with that on some level or another, being able to stay focused. So if I were to pick one game that really dials in on that, it would be Pandemic. Because in Pandemic, the priorities may change throughout the game. The goal of Pandemic is to cure 4 diseases before one of 3 bad things happens to end the game. But the game is dynamic enough that those bad things can be different. Maybe one disease is blowing up so out of control that you're going to end the game if you don't get on top of it. Or maybe you're running out of time. Maybe the longest pole in the tent in the game is we have to cure 4 diseases and we're running out of time. So we're going to have to let other bad things happen, bad things that don't end the game, happen while we focus our efforts on curing the 4 diseases. And Pandemic is the world's best logic puzzle. And it's a cooperative game. I can't recommend it highly enough. My wife and I have played this game literally over 1,000 times. It's a 35, 40-minute play. And for us, it's like doing the crossword puzzle each morning. We sit down, we play it as a team, and it's a different puzzle every single time, just like a crossword. So moving on from prioritization, I feel the second most valuable skill, or maybe tied for the first most valuable skill, is valuation. And valuation is a very tricky subject. When I say valuation, it's how much value you place upon something, knowing there's going to be some sort of cost that comes with that, whether that cost is money or that cost is time. So, for example, the biggest purchase a person usually makes in their life is buying their home. And as you well know, the price of a home is different by magnitudes of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And there's only one axiom in real estate: location, location, location. And in the FI world, I would say, location? Really? That's going to be what you focus mostly on? It depends for the individual. If you are someone like you and Laura who have kids, then the public school system is going to be a very important decision. But if you don't have kids, why would you move to a neighborhood that focuses on public schools and then you pay the premium for that when you're not planning on having kids? And for people closer to my age that talk to me and say, boy, Chris, I wish I could get into retirement earlier as well, I look them in the eye and they say, have you considered selling your house and moving to a less expensive neighborhood? Because that $250,000 difference you make can knock a couple of years, maybe several years off of your working life. And by and large, they don't want to make that choice. They just don't. I can think of a friend right now who could probably knock 4 years off his career if he would move away from a fancy neighborhood and move to a neighborhood that looks a little bit more like mine, which is a fine middle-class neighborhood, but doesn't have the location to it that drives up real estate prices. And location's all about schools and shopping. It's still the same. It's all about schools and shopping and higher demographics.
It's funny, the interplay here, actually, Chris, between valuation and prioritization, which, as you're just describing, okay, I guess maybe on some level, your friend could understand there is a difference in the valuation there, but for whatever reason has placed some priority and or is just not willing, maybe inertia has just kept them there, or it seems difficult to make the decision. But that at its essence is prioritization.
Yeah, exactly. And values are subjective. My values are not your values, are not somebody else's values. So what I have to constantly remind myself is not to impose my values on somebody else. That's not right on most levels. But if somebody says to me, how do I pursue FI? Well, then I am going to start inserting my values, because those values tend toward, all right, well, here's how you need to optimize your money. Here's how you get that $1,000 back a month. Living in a neighborhood that doesn't cost as much as other neighborhoods is worth a heck of a lot of money. You're going to pay a lot less in real estate taxes over time if you live in a house that is valued lower than others. And I'm not saying that you move to a trailer park, not by any stretch of the imagination, but as you well know, there's that concept of enough. What does a good neighborhood look like? Where can you check most of the boxes that you need and be happy with the house that you're in? So the next skill is probability. And I think we've already talked about that a good bit in reference to your daughter. Being able to appreciate probability is a skill that I don't think a lot of people truly appreciate, because they tend to give too much credence to things that are possible but not likely, and not enough credence to things that are both possible and likely in their lives. And a perfect example of this is when you're in the FI community, I often hear somebody use the phrase, I could die tomorrow. And when I hear I could die tomorrow, what I feel like in my head, what I'm really hearing is, I am going to justify this instant gratification.
Yeah.
So when I talk about things that are possible while also being improbable, and I love your example of teaching your kids poker soon, is, drawing it inside straight is very possible. That 7 of diamonds is waiting for you, but it's one of many cards. It's not likely. And when people say things like, I could die tomorrow, yes, it's possible, but it's not likely. And at some point, you have to play the odds. And I think learning how to play the odds is a really important skill to have. And I think that's what your daughter learned playing Quacks of Quedlinburg, is that she has an innate sense of what probabilities look like. And for people in my age bracket, in their 50s, the things that they don't focus on that they probably should is, as you well know, there is an obesity epidemic in the United States. Type 2 diabetes and heart disease are the big killers in my demographic. And people that aren't paying attention to the probabilities of that entering their lives, but are much more concerned about things like airplane crashes, shark attacks, violent crime. All of those things happen, and all of those things are in the news every single day, especially the local news. The local news loves to report about crime because they're selling advertisements. That's what they do. That's how they make their money. They need to get your eyeballs. They're not talking about mundane things on the news because that's not newsworthy. And I would love to see people develop a more healthy appreciation for their real probabilities in life, and strategy board gaming helps hone those skills.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's funny, I haven't exactly figured out the messaging on how to describe this, but I always say, like, you can't argue an anecdote because there's always going to be an anecdote of, like you're saying, something ridiculous like a shark attack or something like that. Is that terribly likely? No. But is there someone, a friend of a friend of a friend, who you could say, oh, they got attacked by a shark? I mean, maybe. But does that mean you're never going to go in the ocean? You have to understand probability. And I think that is what's so important. And that is kind of writ large, that don't argue an anecdote, because there's almost invariably, in any circumstance, 0.1% or 1% or 2% are going to be that anecdote. And it's not going to be as extreme as a shark attack. But when you understand probability and you say, oh, but there's a 99.2% chance that it's going to turn this other way, well, that's how you have to think about it.
Exactly. When I worked at a law firm, we had a client who had won an 8-digit lottery. So to that point, I had never known anybody that had won that sort of lottery. But just in passing, oh, here's such and such. He's here to see this attorney. And by the way, this is the kind of client work we're doing for him. So I saw firsthand, wow, that actually exists. Is it likely? It's so far out of the realm of unlikely. And yet I met one of those individuals. Like you said, I think it's perfect. It's anecdotal. Just because something is possible doesn't mean it's probable. It's not impossible, but it's darn close to it.
Exactly. And like you said, a perfect example of just how to think about probability is actually that game Catan, because you're constantly rolling the dice. And obviously, depending on what the number, like you mentioned earlier, 6 and 8 are the most likely in this game of positive outcome. Now, there's a 7, which is by definition the most likely roll. But okay, you're going to want to have your territory be one of the ones that is on a 6 or an 8, because that's a much higher likelihood of rolling than a 2 or a 12, which is a 1 in 36 chance of each of those, right? So if you're only putting your settlements and cities on 2s and 12s and 11s, it's probably not going to turn out well for you. You might win one game just by sheer luck. I find that hard to believe, frankly. You might, but that doesn't mean it's a good strategy.
Exactly. Oh, you articulated it so well just now, Brad. Yes, you might win. Every once in a blue moon, you will win, but that doesn't make it a good strategy. It's a lousy strategy. And that is what your daughter picked up on so early, and that was what translated forward. She learned probability early, which now she has taken forward into this game that she's just crushing you and Laura at. And as she gets older, those skills are going to benefit her moving forward. It's something that she has baked into her DNA now. She recognizes probability.
Indeed.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So the last of the skills that I was going to talk about is optimization. And this is anybody who's even remotely familiar with FI knows about optimization. Everything in your life requires some level of optimization if you're not pulling down $500,000 a year. If you're pulling down $500,000 a year and your wife's pulling down an extra $200,000 on top of it, you're going to reach FI just because. The numbers are just going to work in your favor. But there's a very large slice of your audience that is firmly somewhere in the middle class who has to 100% optimize their finances to accelerate their FI journey. And optimization is something that we all learn how to do over time. And I'll give a good example of that. If you're going to have a garden, does it make more sense to grow cilantro or tomatoes? And I think the answer would be tomatoes are expensive and you use lots of them, and cilantro is 69 cents a bunch. You're just not good. The optimal crop is going to be tomatoes because they're voluminous and they're expensive at the store, and that's the better use of your time if you're going to use gardening as more of a cash crop. There's lots of reasons to do gardening, and there's lots of really good reasons to grow cilantro just because, but you know where I'm going with this.
Yep.
From a strictly budgetary aspect, grow the tomatoes, grow the cash crops. Strategy board games do the exact same thing. When I talked earlier about when we play a game of Wingspan where you scored 100 and Laura scored 95 and maybe I scored 90, you had optimized your game better than I had. It didn't mean I didn't play an optimal game. I played a perfectly fine game, but you had really honed in on these are the things that I need to do while playing this game to finish in first place. And those skills directly translate into real life, and especially in FI. A lot of people don't bother with optimization in their lives, and they should. And I think FI is one of those endeavors where most people have to learn it.
Yeah.
And so there are lots of games like that focus on optimization. In fact, I would say most strategy board games have an optimization element to it. Common games that your audience may be familiar with are Splendor, Azul, Wingspan, Puerto Rico. These are all games where everybody's going to score a bunch of points at the end, and somebody's going to have more points than somebody else. And the person who has more points just played a little bit more optimal game. They made better decisions, and they were the winner.
Yeah, I like that. One that jumps to mind is one of our favorite games is Seven Wonders. I don't know if you've ever played that.
I love Seven Wonders.
Yeah, that's an amazing game. Actually, interestingly enough, David Gardner from The Motley Fool taught me and Jonathan that game along with Brian Feraldi, which was so cool. And it is a remarkable game of optimization in the sense that there are different ways that you can go. I'm thinking of somebody realizing, oh, nobody around me is going for military.
Right.
So I'm going to get the full allotment of points, which I think is 18 in the rounds. And that's going to be a massive difference. Or, oh, look, the science cards came my way. I can wind up with 30 plus points from science. And it's just those couple little decisions, and you make them early or throughout the game, frankly. It just depends. But that was the game that jumped out to me. That's probably my favorite.
I think you may have hit on the very best example. I hadn't thought about Seven Wonders, but now that I think about it, Seven Wonders, you do exactly 18 things over the course of the game. It's a game that's broken down into 3 rounds, and in each round, you will play 1 card to the table 6 times over the course of a round. So it's 18 decisions that you're making, and your entire game is based on those 18 decisions. And your 18 decisions need to be better than the person to your left or your right. And it can play up to 7 people, which is wonderful. That's one of the things I really like about Seven Wonders is that it's a game that translates well to however many people you have. It plays from 3 to 7. It's a fantastic game. It's a quick play, and it's all about making optimal decisions because it's actually a really fast game. You only do 18 things, and then it's over.
Yeah, once you know how to play, maybe the first time you're sitting there struggling through, it's going to take 30 plus minutes. But once you know how to play, that's a sub 15-minute game in all likelihood. But yeah, to your point, that's a really good one for optimization. So, okay, that was on my list for one of the games that we play rather often. I think we should close this out with some where to start and maybe some of our family's favorite games.
Right. That's a great thing. So strategy board games, like I mentioned, there are thousands and thousands of them. And if you are listening to this podcast and you're not already familiar with strategy board games, it can be absolutely overwhelming. So I'm hoping we're going to bring some value now, helping you as a listener start your journey in strategy board games. Where I would start with the more basic, simple games that don't have too many rules. Some of these strategy board gaming games have an overwhelming number of rules. And if you bring that out as your first game, you have the potential to drive people away from gaming for the rest of their lives. They will have a bad experience and not like it. So start with some of these simpler games. So great starter games that don't have too many rules, but still have a great decision space and are a ton of fun to play. Well, Catan is the grandfather of strategy board gaming for a reason. There's a reason it's sold over 32 million copies. It's a fantastic game. Probably the second most popular strategy board game of all time is a game called Ticket to Ride, where you are building railroads and connecting rail lines over the course of a game and scoring a bunch of points. It's very simple to play, but it's also very subtly difficult to win if you're making suboptimal choices. It's another one of those games that focuses on optimizing because you can't do everything you want to in the game. You're going to have to make some choices. The other two I will mention together are two games called Splendor and Azul. And the reason why I mention these games are they're fantastic games, they're easy to learn, and for whatever reason, they are more popular with women than other games are. And if there's one thing that's true about strategy board gaming is it has traditionally been a male-dominated hobby. If you watch Stranger Things, you see 4 guys playing Dungeons and Dragons around the table to start the thing. And that, unfortunately, hasn't changed all that much over the years. If you go to a board gaming convention, there's one in Charlottesville this weekend that I used to attend regularly, as a matter of fact. I guarantee you, if you're at that board gaming convention, women are outnumbered 8-1 there. And there's no reason. They're just board games, but it is a male-dominated hobby with absolutely no reason to be. So I'm a big fan of Splendor and Azul because for whatever reason, these are games that women like more. So those are the competitive games that I mentioned. All of those games, your goal is to defeat your opponents by finishing the race quicker or by amassing a higher score. And sometimes that isn't the greatest feel, especially if you're not the strongest gamer in the world. If you're constantly finishing in last place, that's not a great feeling. So I would suggest cooperative games as well. Cooperative games where you, maybe as a family unit, are playing against the game, where you as a family or friends win as a team or you lose as a team. And there's a sense of camaraderie that really comes out with that. And like I said, Pandemic to me is the gold standard of co-ops. It came out in 2008. It has probably 10 different spin-offs at this point. And its biggest spin-off, which is considered to be the second best game ever, according to Board Game Geek, and the numbers are always changing, but it's always in top 5, is a game called Pandemic Legacy Season 1, where it combines the cooperative aspects of Pandemic while also telling a story. You're going to play this game over 12 to 24 sessions, and the story is going to unfold as you play it. There's a narrative that goes with it. The rules are going to change, and when you're done with the game, you're done with the game. You will never play it again. It's a story with a beginning and an ending. And as a family, it is fantastic. It's probably the most fun game I have ever played, ever. The last game I'm going to mention for cooperative games are 2 games called The Crew and its spin-off, The Crew Deep Sea. If you have played any kind of trick-taking game, hearts, spades, bridge, oh goodness, any of those games, then The Crew is a 5-minute teach. It's super simple. But when you're playing hearts, you're trying to have the lowest score and win the game against your 3 competitors. In The Crew, you as 4 teammates are trying to satisfy these objectives to win the game. So those tricks that you are taking are cooperative instead of competitive. And those co-ops are just a fantastic way to bring people into gaming that may not like it quite as much or frankly not be as strong at it as others are.
Yeah, I love those examples, Chris. So The Crew Deep Sea is actually one of our most recent games that we've picked up prior to Quacks of Quedlinburg. So that is a cool one. And there's also some aspect of maybe even losing tricks on purpose because it depends what the objective is. So that's a cool game. Another cooperative game that we have played recently that we got for the holidays is the Harry Potter game, Hogwarts Battle.
I've played it. It's a fun game. We really enjoyed it.
That is fun. And it ties into maybe our all-time favorite game in the sense that Harry Potter is both a cooperative game, but it's a deck building game.
Yes.
And Dominion is probably our family's all-time favorite game at this point.
Dominion's a fantastic game.
It is remarkable. There are, I think, 14 or 15 expansion sets. We have just about all of them at this point. And that is an amazing game. Truly amazing. We've played literally, like you said, with Pandemic, we probably played thousands of times in different variations. So that's an absolute favorite. I did want to kind of take a quick step back. So you've mentioned boardgamegeek.com a couple times. That is the single best resource anywhere for board gaming.
Absolutely. If you want to do your basic research about what games do I want to play, go to Board Game Geek and see what their top 100 games are. And again, if you're new to gaming, pay attention to the complexity of the games as well. There's a game called War of the Ring, which is one of my all-time favorite games, and I would never, ever, ever recommend to a new player to take up.
Well, that complexity aspect is really important. And I think one way to kind of get through the complexity for people is to watch playthroughs on YouTube.
Oh,
So
yeah.
this is something that actually Laura in our house is the watcher of these playthroughs, because you can actually see people literally playing the game. As many times as you read the instructions, sometimes you can't grasp the nuance until you actually see a playthrough. So there almost invariably are playthroughs on every game.
Exactly. And Board Game Geek will have a link to all of those. And there are entire YouTube channels dedicated to teaching these games. People have made a career of teaching games. And it's simply the easiest way to learn, truth be told. There's one more web resource I'd like to throw out there while you're there. If you like to play games, some of these games can be played online. And probably the very best resource for that is a place called Board Game Arena. And a premium membership at Board Game Arena is an entire $24 a year. And a lot of these games are already there. Catan, Ticket to Ride, Splendor, Azul, they're all on there. It's amazing how many licenses they've acquired. And so if you're by yourself and you don't have a big social circle, or you just don't have a lot of time, you can do this and play that. Seven Wonders is there. You can play a live game of Seven Wonders on Board Game Arena in less than 10 minutes because it does all of the bookwork for you. You know, it just gives you the cards. There you go. And you can pick up a live match almost instantaneously. It's a fantastic resource.
Yeah, that is a wonderful resource. So I'm just going down my list here. I think we've touched on a lot of the games that are our kind of family favorites. So Seven Wonders, I mentioned. So Ticket to Ride, there are a lot of different versions. We started with the Europe version, and I think there's ever so slightly more complexity to Europe than the traditional Ticket to Ride, which is America. I probably would recommend people start with Europe. It's not terribly complex at all, but you can't really go wrong with either of those. Catan, like we've said, is an absolute must for people getting into this. There are a bunch of expansions and different versions. We have played them all, and our favorite is Cities and Knights. So for anybody who is a Catan player, doesn't want to test seafarers and I don't know, whatever, all the different ones there are. Cities and Knights has been our family's favorite. You mentioned Splendor. That's another one. Some slightly more complicated games that we like are Terraforming Mars and Castles of Burgundy.
Both fantastic games. Absolutely. Castles of Burgundy is just, it's just so much fun to play. It's really good with 3 or 4 people. And the beauty of Castles of Burgundy is if you have a new player to the game, give them board number 8.
Oh.
And the reason why is anyone who's played this game a bunch realizes that board 8 is broken. It's much, much easier to win the game with board 8 than any of the other boards, which is fantastic when you're teaching somebody the game. Give them the easier board. Give them a realistic chance of winning the game.
That's very, very cool. I love that, Chris. And yeah, just a couple of kind of quicker games, I would say. And these aren't necessarily, I don't know, we would argue these are strategy board games. But if you're looking, especially maybe if you have younger kids, I think some of the ones that we started with were a game called Quix, which is Qwixx, and talk about probability learning. That is a fun, quick game that teaches you that. Cover Your Assets is another fun family game that takes 5 to 15 minutes. Monopoly Deal, as much as we hate Monopoly, Chris, Monopoly Deal is just fantastic. It's the antithesis of regular Monopoly.
It's not Monopoly. It has it in the name, and that's the worst part about Monopoly Deal is it has Monopoly in the name. But it's a good game. I played it. It's a fun game.
And then the last two I'll leave everybody with are Sequence and a game called 5 Crowns. So too much to go into every single one of these, of course. But if, again, you have Board Game Geek, you have Google, just look some of these up. And I think we've probably given about 15 to 20 different games here, Chris.
Yeah, and we could just keep on going. But like you said, you're just going to go deeper and deeper into that rabbit hole. But I would leave with dip your toe into the water. Get a couple of the simpler games. Catan, Ticket to Ride. Quix is fantastic. That's a great choice, Brad. Get a couple of those games. See if that strikes a chord with you and your friends and your family. And if it does, I can tell you for me, it's been a lifetime hobby that I never, ever bore of.
Hear, hear. Totally agreed. It has been one of the best things we've ever done as a family. So, Chris, thank you so very much for coming on. This has been just so much fun, and just a wealth of knowledge. So I really appreciate your time.
Oh, Brad, thanks so much for having me. This has been an absolute blast.